And we are at Module 6. Super excited. We're at the halfway point. And a little reminder about us, the Policy Leadership Academy brings together stakeholders, community residents to understand and address local, statewide, and federal issues through a shared knowledge of causes and impact, current problem-solving frameworks, and best practices and actions to address change with an emphasis on policy. This is the breakdown. I highlighted September because, as I mentioned, we are in the beginning of September. This is the first module of September, and we'll be together until mid-October. Just to give you a timeline, a sense of what's happening. The agenda for today, we're going to have our speaker, Mr. James L. Banks Jr. Then we'll have a Q&A. We'll have a little bit of housekeeping, and then you'll be on your way for your Tuesday. And our speaker today is James L. Banks Jr. with Society for Human Resource Management. The topic is public service ethics. I'm going to actually turn it over now to my director, Sylvia, to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you everybody for being here this morning. Mr. James Banks serves as General Counsel for the Society for Human Resource Management and managing SHRM's legal functions. He's overseeing the work outside counsel and serving as key lawyer and legal advisor on major business transactions. We're so thankful that Mr. Banks is here this morning. And a little bit about Mr. Banks is that he served as city attorney to the city of Alexandria, Virginia, representing and advising the mayor, city council, city manager, and city departments on a variety of legal matters. He was previously a partner at Seyfarth Shaw LLP and McGuire Woods LLP, just employment litigation. Mr. Banks began his legal career in Richmond, Virginia, and he practiced law in private and public sectors, including serving as both a prosecutor and a judge. He has a broad background in legal ethics and spent over 10 years in the Virginia State Bar Disciplinary System, ultimately serving as chair of the Virginia State Bar Disciplinary Board. He was an instructor for the Virginia State Bar Professionalism course and has taught frequently on topics of ethics and professionalism. He is also an adjunct professor at Virginia Tech University in the Master of Public Administration program. Mr. Banks is a veteran of the U.S. Army and Virginia National Army Guard. He earned his Juris Doctor from University of Virginia, a master's degree in public policy from Walden University, and a bachelor's degree from Gettysburg College. Again, please help me welcome Mr. Banks with us, and we appreciate your service, and we appreciate having you here this morning with us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sylvia, for that very kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. So happy to be here with you. And thanks, Tracy and the whole team for having me again to speak to you. I know that our session today is 45 minutes. So I'm going to ask Tracy, if I start to go over, please don't be shy about giving me the high sign and let me know that my time is running out, okay? But I am going to jump right into this. Let me see if I can share my screen with you. Here we go. Can everybody see that? All right, great. So we're here for public service ethics. Now, Sylvia has already introduced me, and so you saw just a little bit about some of the things I've done in the past, in particular when it comes to public sector and ethics. I've been in the public sector in a number of different roles, including a prosecutor, a judge, and I've also taught on the topic of ethics and public service on a number of occasions as well. But let's just jump right into it. And as we're jumping into it and we're going to talk, I really like teaching where there's sort of a conversation back and forth. So if we have, I get into anything that you've got questions about, you want to talk about it a little bit more, please feel free to just jump right in. Bring up your question, bring up any topics for further discussion, etc. So we'll also try to have a question and answer session at the end. But again, I think often these sessions go a little bit better if we have questions in real time and we just make it into a discussion. So please feel free to do that. All right. So the very first thing, obviously, public service ethics. What is it? All right. And you see a definition here in front of you, and I'm not going to read that because frankly, most of you can probably read much better than I can. So I'm not going to do that. But when I think about public service ethics, I really think of it very broadly. I personally define it very broadly. And so for me, public service ethics includes ethical behavior and conduct in every aspect of public service, including government, nonprofits, international organizations, NGOs. In my mind, all of that encompasses public service, and therefore we're talking about ethical behavior and conduct in all of those particular areas. And when we're talking about public service ethics, it's more than just a set of standards or guidelines, but actually behavior. What is actually happening in a fair, ethical, above board way. It encompasses both the decision-making that goes into behaviors and conduct and overall tone and tenor of an organization, as well as the overall function of that organization. So in my mind, all of that encompasses public service ethics. And again, you'll find that probably one of the dangers from being taught by a lawyer is that we were taught in sort of the Socratic method. Means I just always ask questions. I ask a question, like to hear some discussion. That's how we were all trained and taught. And so that's sort of how I continue to teach. Whether that's good or bad, I'm not sure, but that's the way it is. So what does it mean to be ethical? All right, obviously we're talking about moral or ethical behavior. But what are those standards that decides and defines what is ethical? Who decides it? And really what it comes down to is that ethical behavior and conduct is often judged by a number of different standards, often overlapping, competing, and making it so that in most situations in which we're trying to find out what is the ethical or appropriate conduct, it's not always crystal clear because there are going to be cross-cutting ethical rules, standards, expectations, etc. And so who is it that decides what is ethical, what is not ethical? The bottom line is that it's all of us, every single one of us. Of course, we are influenced and guided by laws, rules, regulations, ethical standards, whether you're in a profession, etc. But all of those really come down to what do we collectively decide is good, right, appropriate behavior for public servants, because that's really what we're talking about. We're all public servants. And so it's individually, it also has an individual moral component to it. So you have these laws, rules, regulations that will guide us. But at the end of the day, there is also, I think, more pertinent than anything else is one's own particular ethical standard, code, rules. What are your standards? What are your individual standards? And whenever I've taught about these ethical issues, or I sit on a couple of boards in which ethical matters come up, one of the things that really always comes back to me is, what did this individual do, say, or think to get to the position that he or she was in? Did they look at the situation, analyze it? What was what guided that behavior? And that's really what ethical behavior ultimately comes down to, is thinking about analyzing the situations in front of you based upon certain both external as well as internal standards, and then coming to a set of decisions or behaviors that are then viewed by yourself and others as being morally appropriate and or ethical. Any questions, comments? Again, feel free to jump in. Don't be shy with me, okay? All right. So what are some of the formal rules, regulations, or ethical behavior? So when we start to think about what is going to be my guidelines for ethical behavior? I think the very first place that you probably need to look, or what are the formal rules? What are the formal rules, laws, regulations, etc.? Obviously, there are multiple sources for even the formal rules, from the federal, state, and local laws to conflict of interest laws, conflict of interest policies. Right now I am the general counsel for SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management. We are a global organization of over 300,000 HR professionals who work in all sorts of companies, from very small companies to large Fortune 50 companies. But in almost all of those companies, particularly if they're good active SHRM members, we hope they have a conflict of interest policy. So in addition to the formal rules and regulations and laws that may be applicable, your own organizations either should, if they don't have one, they should have one, a set of conflict of interest regulations that guide your own individual organization. In addition to that, I always like to mention the professional associations that we all belong to. As a lawyer, I am bound by the Virginia rules of professional conduct, and the rules of professional conduct for my profession as a lawyer applies whether I'm actually practicing law or not. Some of the more interesting ethical rulings that come down from the state bar are those in which a lawyer is engaged in some activity other than the actual practice of law. And it often will result in a ethical response from the bar on that lawyer, even if what he or she did is not covered by the rules themselves. For instance, in the state bar, we have something called reciprocal proceedings. That is, when a lawyer has done something in another state, jurisdiction, or other forum, and then we, as the state bar, are asked to take some kind of ethical action against that lawyer because of what he or she did elsewhere. For instance, we often find ourselves in a position where we will discipline a lawyer, suspend his or her license, sometimes even revoke his or her license for something completely outside of the practice of the law. For instance, we've disciplined lawyers and taken away their licenses for criminal convictions. In other jurisdictions, for instance. Not too long ago, we've had a couple of lawyers who were convicted in other jurisdictions for embezzlement, etc. Not really during or in the course of the practice of the law, but it was such a ethical violation, or that we believe that activity was an ethical violation under our professional conduct, rules of conduct, because it negatively reflected upon the profession. So I said all of that to say is that when you're looking at ethical behavior and trying to determine whether what you, a colleague, or your organization is doing, you need to look fairly far afield, because a particular course of conduct that may not appear on its face to be directly relevant to whatever rulemaking authority, other law, guideline, etc., that you're looking at, it still may be deemed to negatively impact that set of rules, that law, those guidelines. And you may be subject to ethical sanctions, even if not ostensibly under that body of law, rules, or regulations on its face. So I just keep that in mind. So this is a particular area where boundaries are a little amorphous. Not only the ethical issues themselves a little hard to define. Sometimes it's hard to define when or why or under what set of rules, regulations, etc. someone should or should not be examined, sanctioned, punished, etc. Questions, comments? Sometimes that can be a little confusing. Okay. So, and then we get to the more even less well-defined standards for ethical behavior, your own personal standards, your community standards or expectations. And sometimes that can be even more daunting. Because as you know, what is regarded as being okay behavior in one place may not necessarily be okay in another place. So if you're in a very socially conservative kind of place, and then you go to another place that's much more progressive, the sets of behavior and what is deemed to be appropriate, ethical, moral, etc., can vary greatly. Any thoughts about that? Comments? Anyone have any observations about seeing such a thing in person? It's often can be quite confusing when you look at something and say, hey, when I was working in this particular place, it was said to be okay. Now I moved to this new place and doing this thing, getting a referral from a contractor that had once in the past worked for my company is now deemed to be a no-no, whereas before it was deemed to be okay. What's the difference? Why is there a difference? How should I now recalibrate my thinking and approach to this? Any thoughts, comments? Anyone with examples you'd like to discuss?
James, we did have someone, Karen, in the chat that is agreeing with you. She said that makes sense.
Okay, great. And Karen, did you have something that you're reflecting upon, that an example that you'd like to discuss with us?
Not particularly, but I mean, I think that sometimes even just the difference between maybe the political sector versus the, civilian sector can sometimes shape that a bit as well. What's kind of okay outside of a political environment, maybe inside will be viewed differently. So I think sometimes there can be that type of an approach or a look to it as well.
That's an excellent example. I mean, you heard in my introduction that I'm a military veteran, and there are certain behaviors in the military that are regarded as being very, very verboten. Okay, you just simply cannot engage in. Where in civilian sector, it's not a problem. In the military, you get angry at your boss and you have a bad moment and you say, "Hey, why don't you just go shove that?" Well, you know what? In the civilian sector, you might get a little slap on the wrist. You might even get fired. In the military, you could probably get put in the jail for that. Big difference, right? Diana, I see your hand up, and then Bertha. Diana, I think you're still on mute. There you go.
Thank you. Where I see the issues are where you have the standards that are required by maybe a profession you're in, and then you have the standards that the community are expecting, and then you have your own personal ethics, and how if they don't all align, then you have a struggle, and where to go with that.
Diana, that is exactly, that's a great example. It's very much on point, because the various rules and standards often capture very different things. One of my roles here at SHRM is I'm also the chief ethics officer for our organization. And so we get complaints about allegations of unethical conduct by various SHRM members or people who hold SHRM qualifications or certifications. And it's my job to review those and then place them through the ethical procedures or not. And one of the problems that we have with our members is that our ethical rules are very, very narrow in focus. We really, while we talk sort of broadly about what is appropriate, non-appropriate, ethical and unethical conduct, we only actually take action if there has been a judicial finding that something has been done incorrectly. So if there's a civil judgment or a criminal judgment, then we will take action. But outside of that, our rules are such that we can't really take any actions on alleged unethical conduct. And so that's often a point of real misunderstanding with our members and certificate holders. So Diana, I think you're exactly right. You have to also just see how narrow or broad are the various ethical standards that should apply in any given situation. Bertha, I see your hand is up.
Good morning. I think, if we understand the mission and the vision statement for our organizations, we can always reflect on, what I am doing. Is it accord with that, or is it something that totally goes against those principles as a guide?
You were breaking up there at the end, Bertha, and I'm not sure I caught the very end of there. Could you just repeat the very end part of your comment?
Okay. I was saying that when we understand the mission and the vision statement of our organization, that can help when we're trying to, reflect. Is this something appropriate, or is this something that is not in accord or opposes those principles that we are working for?
No, that's absolutely true. I mean, and I think Bertha's comment, in case everybody didn't hear, is that sometimes what she's saying is an organization's mission statement or goal statement may say one thing, but that doesn't always reflect sort of operationally what is the correct ethical, legal, moral standards, et cetera, that company, that those workers within that company should follow. And that's exactly right. And that's also part of the misalignment. And so I think it's important for us to sort of keep our ethical radar up at all times, because there are so many different things that could apply and render a judgment on our behavior or conduct as being ethical or unethical, depending upon the particular situation in the audience that we're working with. So again, always have to have your radar up, understand what the appropriate ethical standards, rules, and regulations are, and judge your behavior and your actions accordingly. Okay.
And
So
we did have a couple comments in the chat. Keith Stone said, seems like a lot of gray areas when you were speaking before. Donna said, I met my husband at work 35 years ago in New York. It was acceptable and encouraged. Now workplaces relationships are so murky. And Bertha, again, I think that was what she was saying. It's always important to understand our organization's missions and vision statements. Yes, that's both of those comments I think were very much on point. Keith, your comment is one in which whenever I teach this, I always try to tell people, if you leave here and think that you're going to have a certain set of black and white ethical standards that you can apply and just know that you're going to be okay in most given situations, you're not going to get that, because there are very many gray areas, and it is often, unfortunately, situationally specific. And the final comment there about appropriate workplace relationships, very, very true. I mean, in my both in my previous law firms as well as when I was with the city of Alexandria, one of the things was that we were expressly prohibited from having relatives work with us and for us. Here at SHRM, however, that is absolutely not the case. We have a number of people who are related, who work here within our organization. In my particular situation, one of my nephews is actually a SHRM employee and works here. Now, what we do to ensure fair treatment among all employees is that if you have a relative or close friend, then that person can't be a direct report of yours. You cannot be in a chain of command in which you rate that person, etc. But other than that, we can absolutely have relatives working here. So just an example. So again, as we were talking earlier, in addition to all of the rules and regulations that we were talking about, there is a specific place where your own individual reflection and personal standards also come into play. And in many instances, I would argue that that may be the most important thing to think of. When you're in an environment in which we've already established a number of different ethical laws, rules, regulations may apply, and they may not apply in every circumstance, you should have a very firm set of guidelines that you yourself will follow, and that you can use if ever called upon to justify what your own actions were. One of the things that I always say to folks, I said it when I was working with the city of Alexandria in local government, I said to my clients here, is that conflicts and ethical problems almost always fade
if there's transparency. When in doubt, disclose. When in doubt, talk about what you think might be an issue, but you're not so sure. I have yet to see someone get into an ethical problem if they talk about it, if they disclose it up front. Disclosure in the area of ethics, disclosure covers a multitude of sins. So when in doubt, talk about it. When in doubt, call up your supervisor, call up your general counsel, call up your head of HR, go see your CEO, but talk about whatever issue you think you're having, talk about it with someone is my very first rule of how to deal with potential ethical issues. Questions, comments? Great. So what are some of the basic ethical expectations that we have for public servants in particular? And do those expectations for public servants differ from those that we have in the private sector? Often I would say they do. There is often a higher level of expectations for ethical conduct when someone's in the public sector, when you're deemed to be a public servant in one way or another. And the very first thing that I always say is to avoid what looks like a conflict of interest. Now, unfortunately, given the hyper-competitive environments that we now live in, and socially things have just changed, people will often throw out, well, you have a conflict, as a way of criticizing you when you really don't. Okay, I'll give you an example. When I was the city attorney for Alexandria, I had left, and as you had heard, I had been partner at 2 previous law firms. One of my previous law firms was McGuire Woods. When I left the firm and came to the city of Alexandria, I, of course, was no longer employed by McGuire Woods, had no financial interest in McGuire Woods, but I knew those lawyers, and some of those lawyers I trusted and knew them to be high quality lawyers that I wanted to use for my lawyer, my outside lawyer, when I was the city attorney. So I hired McGuire Woods on a number of cases to represent me and the city of Alexandria in some disputes. There was a period of time in which we had some redevelopment going on in our waterfront downtown. And it was hard fought sort of thing, as these things often can. Anybody ever been through local changes in zoning, et cetera, you know, people get really upset about those issues, and they can engage in all sorts of just very strident fights over that. So while I was city attorney there, we had a number of those kinds of fights going on, back and forth, litigation all the time. But we, the city, were successful in all of those litigation. During that period of time, we had, I think it was 4 separate cases that wound their way through our local courts, went up to the intermediate appellate courts, and went all the way to our Virginia State Supreme Court. In all of those cases, the position that I was leading the city in, we won. Well, clearly, my opponents didn't like that so much. And McGuire Woods was my outside counsel that was helping me get these wins. And so after like the 3rd or 4th win, then all of a sudden there was this sort of letter campaign in the local press saying, oh, City Attorney Banks has a conflict of interest because McGuire Woods is working for him on these cases. It's funny because that whole issue about conflict of interest didn't come up at the beginning. It was only after McGuire Woods helped me win all 4 of those cases that all of a sudden I had a conflict of interest. So I said all of that to say that allegations of conflict of interest, allegations of ethical misconduct, while we all as public servants need to be very much aware of them and behave appropriately under all the circumstances, we also need to know that those allegations can often be misused and used for political advantage, unfortunately. Questions, comments? Great. This is just one sort of data point, and I put public trust in government here to show that obviously trust in government has gone down over the years. But similarly, there's been similar research that indicates that public trust in all public institutions has declined over time. And that's something that we need to be mindful of. And I think that that speaks to even more why we should ensure that our behavior, our conducts, what our organizations are doing and how they're doing it adheres to the highest ethical standards possible. Okay. How do we do that? How do we do that? Do you rely upon, again, we put all this stuff together. So we're talking about, you got these sets of laws, you got these sets of regulations, you've got these local conflict of interest rules, you've got public gadflies who may be talking to you about this or that. Then you've got your own sort of internal compass. What do you follow? When do you follow what rule? When do you follow what regulation? When do you just follow your own gut? Okay. When I'm reminded of all of this, I'm reminded of Justice Potter Stewart's famous quote back in the Supreme Court case of Jacobell versus Ohio. And you will recall that this was the Supreme Court case in which it was being litigated what is or is not pornography. What's acceptable under community standards? Because that was sort of the phrase back then. Was it acceptable under the general community standards of the time? And I think Justice Potter Stewart hit upon it when he said, look, he said, I'm not sure I can define it for you. I'm not sure I can tell you and give you a definition, an explanation, a paragraph as to what is pornographic, what is not pornographic. I just know it when I see it. Unfortunately, that kind of amorphous thing is what we deal with in ethical issues all the time. You know, is it truly unethical for your nephew to work for you in this organization? I'm not sure. Is it really appropriate for you to hire your previous employer to do some consulting for your current company? I'm not sure. What do your rules say? What does the law say? You have to engage in that very thorough analysis to get to a usable answer. And I know I can hear you now. It's like, you're not giving me much in the way of guidelines, are you? Probably not concrete guidelines. What really this is designed to do is to give you sort of a bullet points to think about, things to think about, and make sure that you check them off on your mental list, saying, I've looked at this, I've looked at what my organization's rules of conduct are, I looked at what I think the applicable laws are, and I've really sort of thought about it personally, and I'm okay with that. Then you should feel good about that move, good about that decision, good about the direction and behavior of your organization. Okay, now, the final point I want to make on this is, you know, you've heard my introduction, you know that I am at least a part-time teacher. So I've got to sort of fall back to this academic thing and give you at least something concrete to take from about how to engage in this kind of ethical decision-making. All right. There's a famous academic, Terry Cooper, who came up with this 5-step approach back in a book he wrote in 1998. And you see the 5 steps in front of you. And really, this is not to say this is the only way to do it, but this gives you a kind of specific concrete model by which you can think about how do I analyze and think my way through an ethical conundrum. First of all, you take a look at what's the task, what's the function, what's the thing you're supposed to be doing. All right. And when I say you, I mean you individual or your organization. All right. And within that activity, what is the potential ethical issue? Okay. It may be that, for example, the task is to engage in some strategic planning. And the person that you've identified to help you in that sort of outside consultant is a former employee of your current organization. So the potential ethical issue is, under these circumstances, is it okay for us to hire this former employee to help us with this critical thing that we're trying to do? That's the ethical issue. And then you identify alternative courses of action. Okay, you can hire this particular person. You can continue to look for other outside consultants. You can ask your community of colleagues for other recommendations. You can even go back to this one that you were considering hiring and saying, do you have other recommendations for folks that we could hire if we determine that is an ethical issue for us to hire you? And then take a look at what are each of those outcomes? What's the possible consequences for that? In other words, something like the following. The person who is the former employee of yours is clearly regarded as the best person in the industry to help you with this planning. So the possible consequences may be that you're trading off the demonstrably best person to get someone of lesser qualifications or abilities to avoid a potential ethical issue. Is that worth it? Then you have to take all of that information and just find a fit. Go through this analysis using those 4 parts that are listed here: moral defenses, rehearsal of defenses, ethical principles, anticipatory self-appraisal, etc. Using all of that information, what's the best fit under these circumstances? Again, not necessarily the only way to think about it, but I wanted to, at least in all of this amorphous gray area, give you one piece of concrete, one concrete tool that you can take with you to use. Questions, comments? Okay. I see this is sort of concludes the initial part of my presentation. I see Donna has her hand up. Donna.
Good morning. This is so interesting. One thing that I don't know if you know is where we live in the Antelope Valley, we don't have large pools of professionals in a lot of in a lot of areas. So
yeah.
Everything in my life is a conflict of interest. I'm constantly disclosing, but the reality is that, there are only certain people and you always want the best. I try to be as forthright as coming, that I'm a medical accountant. So like if something comes up, I'm like, I'm on the board of Palmdale Regional Medical Center. Like I'm trying to constantly disclose, but I got to tell you, I worry because I'm an accountant, I think we worry about that more here in the AV because the pool of the best is so small that you tend to keep going back to the same people that you clearly have some kind of relationship with. So any advice? Have you seen anyone struggle with that before?
So I absolutely have seen lots of folks struggle with that, Donna. And I would go back to one of my earlier comments, and that is disclosure of the potential conflict. That is, again, that I will repeat what I said earlier. Disclosure covers a multitude of sins and potential sins. Simply having folks to walk through it with you to say, hey, there's this potential conflict. I want to talk to you about it. Do you think it's something that we can work through, etc.? I'll give you another example. When I was the city attorney in Alexandria, I was the chief attorney for all of the departments in all of their issues. One of the clear examples of when a conflict would come up is when I was advising a department during budget season. The city manager is the one who puts together the budget, right? So here I'm advising the city manager about budget issues overall. Then I'll have another department come to me about their own individual budget issues. Can I ask for more money for this? Should I ask for more money from that? That's clearly in many ways pitting me as the advisor for the Department of Health against the city manager as he's putting together his whole budget. Again, the manner in which I worked through that was again and all of these people knew this, but it's always helpful to talk to them again about it and remind them. So you say to the head of the Department of Health, sure, I'm happy to talk to you about this, but you also know that I'm advise the city manager generally about his budget. Are you okay with that? Oh, sure, sure, sure. I just want to run this by you. And then I talk to the city manager saying, you know, that as I'm advising you about this budget overall, that I also talk to each of the department heads and I'm giving them advice and guidance. Are you okay with that? You have any particular issues with any of the departments that you really want me to be mindful of, etc. And so sometimes you engage in that process more informally, and sometimes you engage in it more formally. I'll give you another example of how you do it in a more formal way. So that's an example of how you just do it informally, okay? In the legal profession, when we have legal conflicts of interest, we are required under our rules of professional conduct to get waiver letters. So for instance, I have a law firm that I use for a lot of my outside counsel activities. We recently hired a different company to help us with IT issues. So we outsource much of our IT function is what it came down to. This law firm came to me and says, yeah, we're happy to continue to advise you, but for your information, we also advise your new IT provider on this one minor issue involving something. That is technically a conflict. We need to advise you of that. Are you okay with that? I said yes. And they say, well, now I'm going to send you this conflict waiver letter. And they're going to send you, then they send a conflict waiver letter to the IT firm. We both have to sign off on it. And it's kept in our record. That's a more formal way of engaging in disclosure and documenting it.
James, this is Tracy. We also have a chat in a comment in the chat. It is Karen. Is it ethical to go with the lesser employee to avoid the ethical implications?
It potentially is. You know, for instance, it really depends upon how obvious and sort of hard the conflict is. Okay, but let's take a really clear example. Let's say, you know, the best local accounting firm is Banks Accounting LLP. That happens to be run by my wife. Okay, but everybody knows that she and her firm are the absolute best. Okay, I would feel very uncomfortable in hiring her to do my audit. I could not do that. And so despite the fact that number 2 on the list is generally regarded as being not nearly as high quality as my wife's accounting firm, I could not truly that seems to be a hard conflict. And so I would go with number 2 because it would be, in my mind, a hard conflict and put me, my company, her firm, everybody in direct, and I would avoid that one. So there are circumstances in which, yes, going with the number 2 provider, if you will, is the way to avoid the conflict, and is probably the best way to avoid the conflict. Okay.
That makes sense.
Questions? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, would that basically entail then, if it's just almost a blatant and obvious, you know, conflict of interest, or one where I guess it sounds more like it's almost like a you know, risk benefit analysis. It's like, you know, do the risks of, you know, having the, you know, obvious conflict, even if they are the best, outweigh those benefits? And in this case, the answer would be yes. Is that kind of the analysis that's performed each time? Or, you know, again, it's very situational. It's kind of what I'm hearing also. So
yes, no, you're right on all those counts, Karen. Yes, it is very situational. That is the kind of analysis and that you go through every time. And it really is, in many ways, a cost benefit analysis. And you also mentioned something that is also very, very important to remember. And that is, sometimes there are actual conflicts. And then there are other times that are just a perception of a conflict. The actual conflicts almost always will require you to find a different solution, a different workaround. For instance, I'll give you one, again, hate to keep using these legal examples, but they're the ones that come to mind most immediately. If I'm a criminal defense lawyer and I have 2 potential defendants come to me, and let's take an obvious example. It's a murder case, all right? And the prosecution says either Mr. Jones pulled the trigger, or Mr. Smith pulled the trigger. All right. And Mr. Jones is going to say Mr. Smith pulled the trigger. Mr. Smith's going to say Mr. Jones pulled the trigger. Clearly, I cannot represent both of them. That's a real hard conflict. Okay. It's either one or the other. That's not even a close one. All right. A different example would be, okay, Mr. Jones is being sued by Mr. Smith. Okay. Mr. Jones wants me to represent him, and I agree to represent him. But then Mr. Smith comes back and says, you can't represent Mr. Jones because you represented me 10 years ago on something completely different. That's a perception of a conflict. That's not a real conflict. Okay. And so that's the difference. So those hard conflicts are almost always something you've got to find a different workaround. Perception of conflicts, sometimes you can find a way to just do what somebody's claiming is a conflict. Okay. But again, Karen, it's very situational. I just cannot give you a hard and fast rule that'll work every single time. Okay.
That makes sense.
Tracy,
Thank you.
Tracy, I see my time is probably about up.
Nope, you're good to go.
So I still have time to go through my exercise a little bit. Okay. All right. Well, I was checking back with Tracy because I intentionally broke this presentation up into sort of two pieces. One is sort of just sort of factual presentations here, go through the principles, et cetera. And then I had an example that I wanted to quickly go through with you. So this is an exercise, and I say exercise, it's really just sort of a real world example. Names have been changed to protect the not so innocent. I'll just disclose to you, this occurred when I was the city attorney in Alexandria. Okay, this is something shortly after I got the job, this is what happened. City manager comes to me and says, all of these issues happen. All right, we had an HR employee who was arrested for embezzlement. Rec department employee was arrested for assaulting a kid. Police officer was improperly selling stuff. A newly hired deputy director was convicted of a serious crime in another jurisdiction. Somebody else was arrested for theft and forgery and use of a false information. I didn't even put down in here one of the more juicy ones, and I always like to remember it because it's just so crazy. This was a guy who his job was to empty the quarters out of the local parking meters, right? And so there was an audit, and it determined that over time, the receipts from the parking meters had steadily gone down under his watch. He was in charge of collecting the receipts from this. So we're like, okay, so they did an audit. They found out, yeah, it's not quite matching. Something's going wrong here. They were able to get some other information, ultimately leading to a search warrant. Search warrant was executed upon this person's house. They go into his garage and they find bags of quarters to the tune of $100,000. Yeah, so you just can't make this up. So the city manager and I basically put our heads together. We're like, so we've got a problem. We have an issue. So what do we do? So the very first thing, after I stopped doing this, I then said, okay, how do we handle this? Because it was not one single thing. As you saw from the examples, it was many things across all different organizations involving different employees, et cetera. And so really what it was speaking to the ethical culture of our organization. Somehow we had allowed the ethical culture of our organization to get a little bit off track. And so really the question was, how do we get this back on track? That was the question in front of us. So what we did is we came together and formed this ethics initiative committee involving representatives from all across the organization, city manager's office, my office as city attorney, HR, police, communications, departments, other departments with particular impact, such as the the finance and revenue collecting functions, et cetera. How did we handle that? We engaged in, the first phase was the analytical phase, trying to figure out what issues were involved. Were there criminal issues involved? Were there non-criminal issues involved? We then ultimately recommended best solutions for each of the particular departments, etc. Then we engaged in that solution phase, okay? We created an ethics initiative. It was a thorough guideline document about very clear ethical standards and expectations for everybody. We created a very new ethics and fraud hotline. Then we engaged in training for everybody in the organization. So new employees coming in got trained, all current employees got trained, and then everybody got retrained at first every 6 months because we thought we had a real problem. And then thereafter, every year, annual training, again, to make sure that we were just hammering home what the ethical expectations were for our organization. This seems like a non-substantive phase, but I would submit to you that in the public sector, when we're talking about public, this may be one of the more important phases, the communication phase, because obviously what we had just described hit the front page of the local paper, and week after week we were getting all these bad stories. So the entire community was well aware of the problem that was happening. And because of that heightened community awareness, there was a perception that we were an unethical organization, or at least ethically challenged in some ways. So we needed to turn that around. We needed to try to do everything we could to regain public trust. So we created this communications plan, and it was, I think, one of the more important aspects of what we did is just making sure that we let people know what we were doing. Whenever we had another problem, we communicated it. We tried to be just as open and transparent as possible. Okay, that was it. That was the real world example that we faced, and how we dealt with it. Any questions, comments, thoughts from anyone? Tracy, I will turn it back over to you.
If we do have any questions, obviously you can put them in the chat if you're not wanting to take yourself off mute, or if you're wanting to take yourself off mute. I'll just wait just a couple seconds, see if we have anybody coming off.
James, one other question that I had is have you ever encountered an occasion where the individual's ethics kind of were higher than the organizational standards, and the conflict that can sometimes ensue when maybe not playing? You kind of touched on it, early on about like the different environments in which, ethical issues can arise. But usually, that was more of like, catching up to speed of where the organization was. But when the organization lacks behind one's personal ethics, any thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. I have had those issues. And frankly, Karen, those can be the more problematic ones, because what it does is it makes you as an organization do a review and make sure you're at an appropriate place. You think you're at the appropriate place ethically, you're doing what you believe to be ethical. But at the same time, you never want to discount an individual's ethical stance. And so the difficult part is when you've got somebody who believes, for instance, that you should not hire this particular accounting firm to do the annual audit, and she's got specific reasons for that she firmly believes in. Okay, you have to make sure that you, in situations I've had, is we sit down with the person. We said, we understand your concerns. Your concern is one that we also were concerned with. But let me tell you how we came to make the decision that we did. We walk you through it, etc. At the end of the day, you hope that the employee understands that and is able to move forward despite the fact that they came at a different place. Normally, and at least in my experience, when you demonstrate to your employees that you, in fact, have thought about the issue, that you engaged in specific, concrete, well-considered steps to examine it, and that you engaged in the appropriate analysis and that you simply came at a different place, that usually satisfies them, because usually what they think is people, you made this without even thinking about it. No, let me show you how we thought about it. Usually that fixes it. I certainly have heard of issues in which it hasn't fixed it, Karen. Then that gets you to an entirely different issue that I'm not sure we have the time to talk about today. But usually when you go through that analysis and communicate it to your workforce, that usually gets you there.
That helps a lot. Thank you.
And again, thank you so much, Karen, for the question. Anyone else having any question, comments? Tiara has raised her hand.
Speaking about your last comment, and thank you for all of the information. It was a lot. It sounds like when you have to explain, it takes a lot of time. So like when you're trying to pass some of these things, how do you balance, trying to address issues like you did when you moved into your position with the last example, and the time?
Tiara, you're right. It does take a lot of time, but I think that you minimize that time on an ongoing basis by putting in the thought, analysis, and hard work up front. That is, if you just join an organization, for instance, and you realize that they do not have an internal code of conduct or set of ethical standards that align with the mission and goals of the organization, I would take a lot of time to develop that, to communicate that to all of your stakeholders, internal, external, board, etc. When you engage in that process, that process up front helps minimize the time that you have to spend on the back end on specific issues as they come up. You can almost do sort of a short frame reference to it. You say, oh, you remember the ethical standards that we took 8 months to develop. Okay, now according to that, this is inappropriate for these reasons. Okay, rather than going through the full analysis, you refer them back to what they know we spent so much time on. In my experience, that helps. You've got to put that hard work in up front and let folks know that this is not just an afterthought for you or your organization, but rather something that has been well thought out, well considered, you spent time on, spent organizational resources on, and you're comfortable where you are. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Great.
Do we have any other questions or comments for James Banks? Just gonna give it another couple seconds to see if anyone has any. You can also put them in the chat. And so I'm not seeing any. So if we can please give Mr. James Banks either a virtual or an actual applause. Thank you so much. We so appreciate your time today. It was very informative. Public service ethics can be such a dry subject. You made it very interesting. So thank you so much. And I'm just going to share my screen and we're going to take care of a couple of housekeeping. Can everybody share? Can everybody see my screen? Yes. Okay. And so group site, I've seen a couple people responding to the questions. What we do is after the speakers, the module speakers, we post a question just to kind of get some interaction and some exchange of ideas. So I welcome you to check out the group site and respond. If you're having any trouble, please email me and we'll walk you through that. So again, that's our group site where we can exchange ideas and really kind of keep the conversation going. Again, follow us. We're on Linktree. We have our YouTube, which you'll be getting this this video, but you'll have the YouTube. You can follow us on Facebook. You can follow us on Instagram. So please do so. And there's my information, as you know, because you received my emails. Next week is Mr. Polo Morales. He is with the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, speaking on social justice. So that will be next week. Super excited to have him. And finally, as always, thank you so much for spending your Tuesday morning with us. We greatly appreciate it. And we will see you next Tuesday, same time at 9 o'clock. And thank you so much for joining us. Stay cool today. Going to be 110. So stay cool out there. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Gracias. Have a wonderful day.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it. 110. Ugh. Bye. Thank you.
Stay hydrated.
Coffee